All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started as folks start to trickle in. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's seminar. My name is Bridget Smith, and I am one of the One Health Institute Try Harder, Be Better grant recipients, along with Amy Bond, Una Preston, and Brooke Genovese. We're excited to welcome Dr. Beth Rose Middleton as our speaker today. Dr. Beth Rose Middleton is a professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. She holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching center on Native environmental policy and Native activism for site protection using conservation tools, and her broader research interests include intergenerational trauma and healing, rural environmental justice, digital humanities, African and Indigenous intersections in the Americas, rural environmental health, and Indigenous analyses of climate change. Dr. Middleton has written 2 books, Trust in the Land, New Directions in Tribal Conservation, and Upstream, focusing on the history of Indian allotment lands at the headwaters of the California State Water Protection. Dr. Middleton has published articles and chapters on a range of topics, including Native American cultural heritage protection, Native economic development, Indigenous approaches in political ecology, federal Indian law as environmental policy, and the application of market-based conservation tools to Indigenous site protection. Dr. Middleton is passionate about increasing underrepresented perspectives in academia and environmental policy and planning. Thank you, Dr. Middleton, for joining us today for our talk about opportunities and challenges in collaborative, community-engaged Indigenous environmental justice research.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for this wonderful series. I'm grateful to be participating. I am going to go ahead and share screen. Okay. So I'd like to start with where we are at University of California, Davis, within Patwin homelands, Southern Wintun homelands. And this land acknowledgement was developed between the university and 3 nations whose homelands we are within. And I'll read it and then just briefly reflect on it. So we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachildihi Band of Wintun Indians of Calusa, Quetzaldihi Wintun Nation, and Yochadihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. And so, as many of you probably know, the land acknowledgement is very important, and you're probably hearing land acknowledgements and seeing them in many places today. But a land acknowledgement is very much a first step, a recognition of where we are and an allusion to the context of how we came to be established within these sovereign nations' homelands. And then the next step beyond the acknowledgement is, what do we do with this information? How do we participate in land repatriation, rematriation, cleanup of homelands that may have been impacted by Western development, etc. So I think my talk may touch on some of these ideas. Okay, this is a mouthful, this topic: opportunities and challenges in collaborative, community-engaged Indigenous environmental justice research. I'd like to point out first, I'm in the Department of Native American Studies, and I've been thinking a lot lately about elements of Native and Indigenous studies, NAIS, approaches to environmental policy. First, history and context, understanding how past relationships and structures, such as the State Water Project, for example, which is a subject of my book Upstream, how those relationships and structures inform current relationships and resources. Why might it be difficult to establish relationships or partnerships for research or other endeavors? It has a lot to do with the colonial history and then the ongoing colonial structures that are in place. foregrounding and centering Indigenous ways of knowing, as well as Indigenous knowledge, how people might choose to share knowledge, and knowledge that is very place-based and maybe founded on a different perspective to the surrounding world, to humans and non-humans, than is often seen in Western institutions. Maybe more relational approaches that go back to narratives that describe how the world was formed and people and other beings came into relation with each other. So engaging in these partnerships requires recognition of different ways of knowing and being and different histories in landscapes. How can our work recognize and support Indigenous governance, self-determination, and sovereignty? And finally, considering decolonization, what are some of the colonial approaches or ways of working that are in place, and how do we recognize those, challenge them, and do things differently? So I'll talk about two different examples of research that I'm involved with, which I think falls under the broad umbrella of collaborative Indigenous environmental policy or environmental justice research. Looking particularly at water contamination, how to detect that contamination and trace its impacts throughout the community. A One Health approach fits really well here, I think, because you're talking about impacts of contamination on human health, on all multi-generational health, on animals, and on plants, really throughout the ecology. And then water governance and restoration from both an intertwined ecological and cultural perspective, because in partnership with Indigenous nations, those are not separated. And some of what really comes into the conversation are legacy impacts. So impacts of mining during the gold rush, impacts of timber management and harvests from the 70s and 80s. So these have ongoing, they cause ongoing issues within the population and the environment. How do we support the development of tools to assess, identify, and respond to those impacts locally? And that's intertwined with climate resilience and multi-benefit restoration by addressing legacy water infrastructure. So not only impacts contaminants in the water, but impacts and infrastructure on water systems, such as dams or various water conveyance structures that are causing more harm to the system, that were developed without thinking about ecology or a One Health approach. So I feel that researchers in environmental science and policy and beyond have responsibilities to consider these questions very basically. Whose homelands are you or your projects located within? Do you know the history in those homelands of Indigenous peoples, of other peoples of color? Does your agency know the history? How do you engage with that history? I think I would add here too, do you know the fact that you're within the purview of a sovereign tribal nation? How do you engage on a government to government basis within your institution? Are you responding to the needs, interests, and concerns of Indigenous peoples, which may involve the health of culturally important species, food, medicine, basketry plants, different animals, different fish, etc. Other issues around access to land, and not only access to be able to gather, but to steward and take care of the plants and animals that are on that land, such that that access is really meaningful, and to be able to protect those spaces from development or other incursions. And accurate representation and recognition, which often means partners speaking together, not one speaking for the other. And then, are you responding to environmental injustice issues? I feel that because there are so many layered environmental injustices, hopefully the work of folks in environmental science and policy and in health and environmental health are always responding to environmental injustice. And then in order to develop collaboration, it requires building and sustaining relationships, which involves both parties bringing things to the table to share and that are of value to each other. So to think about where we are within California, the map on the left shows the great diversity of Indigenous nations within California. I always think of California, or what is now known as California, as an international context with all of these different nations, and all of California being areas that are culturally important and vital to these different nations. The map on the right is a picture of contemporary recognition of tribal lands. So the lands that are in the orange color here and here, you can see in many small parcels, these are under tribal jurisdiction. So this is a powerful juxtaposition, because on this map you can see that all of California is culturally important and is tribal homeland. But on the right you can see the disjunct with the fact that only small amounts of California are under tribal jurisdiction. So tribes have interests and concerns and environmental justice issues that are throughout this whole area, but often are limited in the ability to address those issues because it's not within lands recognized as under tribal jurisdiction. And the story of how these lands came to be so reduced is a longer story about the non-ratification of treaties with Native nations in California, the violent stance of eradication of Indigenous peoples by the first governor and the early administrations of California, and the seizure of tribal lands for a variety of purposes, including the development of higher education institutions. I encourage people to look at the land grab report from High Country News on that topic. So sorry, this is a bit blurry. This is a flyer from Winnemem-Wintu event, and Winnemem-Wintu people have been really at the forefront of educating the broader population about the importance of salmon in particular, and of protecting and restoring the watersheds that enable salmon to move from the ocean to upstream. And the concept of being salmon people is one that is echoed by different indigenous nations throughout Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, in many different places. And it really implies a cultural connectedness, a relationship, and a set of responsibilities that goes back to the development, the creation of the world and of humans and salmon in relationship to each other. So it's a very deep concept. So I begin there to talk a little bit about some work I've been involved with to recognize tribal beneficial uses of water. And this is state policy speak. The State Water Resources Control Board defines beneficial use categories, and then regional water boards designate specific water bodies with beneficial uses. And then what flows from the BUs are water quality objectives. So what level of water quality do you need to protect a beneficial use? And that may involve placing limits on pollutants so that that beneficial use is not impacted. So some examples of beneficial uses that are recognized in the state of California: harvesting shellfish, navigation, hydropower, agriculture, aquaculture, etc. But I think there is a unacknowledged environmental injustice in terms of what is missing from this list of recognized beneficial uses of water. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept, but what is environmental justice? It's fair treatment, meaningful involvement of all people with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental law, regulation, and policy. From Indigenous perspectives, this is specifically attentive to settler colonial structures that have tried to separate people from their homelands as a foundational environmental injustice. And some specific issues in Indigenous environmental justice involve culturally specific pathways of exposure that are not typically accounted for. So some understandings of exposure are based on a non-native urban individual who's not in contact with a particular water body, even near their homeland, who's not eating from that water body, who's not swimming in that water body, who's not praying in that water body. So their level of exposure is much different than an Indigenous person, that it is maintaining a relationship with a particular water body in a variety of different ways. And I'll talk a little more about that. And in general, there can be a lack of information about contaminants, a lack of remediation efforts, and broadly protection for Indigenous peoples within their homelands, which may include contaminated lands and waters. So with that in mind, the beneficial uses did not include recognition of tribal specific beneficial uses. There was a great deal of tribal activism, an upwelling of activism. Tribes sent letters to the State Water Resources Control Board back in 2013 and even before, stating that existing beneficial uses as they're outlined did not protect their cultural uses or their subsistence relationships with waterways throughout their homelands. And so there was a process of developing language. And in 2016, the Water Board adopted a resolution calling on staff to expand the proposed beneficial use categories with 2 categories pertaining to tribal, traditional and cultural use, and tribal subsistence fishing. And this is some of the overview, recognizing the importance of beneficial uses unique to Native nations in California, recognizing cultural practices and ways of life, recognizing that California waters are impacted by contamination and pollution, and that there are specific challenges for tribes and tribal members that stem from those impacts. So my colleague and my friend here on campus, he's a researcher in environmental science and policy, Fraser Schilling, he conducted a tribal fish use study in 2014. And it was modeled on some other studies looking to quantify tribal fish consumption throughout the state, which is a very challenging thing to do, which I'll talk a little bit more about for a variety of reasons. But the goal was to adjust the water quality standards to recognize that people are eating much more fish from local waterways than had previously been recognized, because the regulators were not taking into account tribal fish consumption. And the higher the rate of consumption that's found, then the lower the pollution limit to protect people's health. But if consumption is low, there can be a higher threshold of pollution because there are presumably less people eating fish from the water. But previous studies showed that in Oregon showed that tribal consumption was much higher than previously thought. He did historical and contemporary aspects to the survey and found that it was extremely culturally important and widespread, and that consumption is happening even though it's impacted by development and species decline. So now, that study was done. It was important that language was passed. Those beneficial uses are established. But now the challenge is to adopt and apply those beneficial uses on specific water bodies throughout the state. So I'm working on a project within Region 5 of the Water Board, which is most of the state's the Central Valley and reaches all the way up into far northeastern corner of California. And I wanted to speak briefly on navigating the research space in collaborations. It's not necessarily straightforward or clear. I think from my perspective, always first and foremost should be tribal-led research on consumption patterns, that data should be internal, that it makes sense for tribal members to be collecting that data within their population, and also recognizing that many tribes have robust environmental departments who have already been monitoring the health of species within their homelands for many years. So what are some of the roles for university partners? In Native American studies, we're hoping to partner, or I am hoping to partner and continue partnering with different organizations and tribes who are gathering this information on consumption. We have a partnership with a researcher in wildlife, fish, and conservation biology to look at contaminants in fish tissues. And then we're also thinking about toxicology and broader contaminants within fish and other marine species in the system, and thinking about remediation in addition to advocating for reduced discharges. And the key to a partnership between the university and tribes and Native nonprofits is supporting the movement of research to policy. So we can do really interesting research on what contaminants are in the water or the level of contaminant in the fish. But it really takes a partnership and I think strategic work and relationships to move that research to impact policy. So just to speak a little bit more about these beneficial uses, tribal traditional and cultural use, that the cultural beneficial use recognizes uses of water that support cultural, spiritual, ceremonial, traditional ways of life, including what's listed here. And even the language of use is challenging because it's more than a use, I think, from Indigenous perspectives. It's a relationship. But use is the language in policy, so it's approximate, I guess, to insert in this space recognition of tribal stewardship and engagement with the waterways so that tribal health can be protected. Traditional subsistence fishing use focuses on harvest for subsistence, for local consumption, to meet local needs. And that, I just thought this was a beautiful graphic, the Yurok Traditional Aquatic Harvesting Calendar from their climate change adaptation plan. So applying beneficial uses, some of the work we had proposed and is in process but fluctuating, have been thinking about conducting studies. That was the original ask, conducting studies to make the case for the application of beneficial uses to waterways throughout Region 5, to support the designation of waterways as having these tribally specific beneficial uses. There was the question of needing data-based water quality objectives to protect the beneficial uses. And I mentioned the lack of the application of these tribal specific beneficial uses, but support from the Water Board for studies to acquire the information to advocate for the application of these beneficial uses. This is a bit of a, I'm not going to go through this because I want to talk about another example briefly as well, but this is some of the process that's in place to get these beneficial uses designated on water bodies. So a few ongoing concerns, having enough personnel to do the data gathering to support the protection of tribal values and interests, the challenge of how long this all takes. I mean, you just saw in this graphic, oh, whoops, sorry, multiple years to get these beneficial uses recognized. During that time, people's health is still impacted by contaminants that may be in the water. And then once the beneficial use, the tribal specific beneficial use of culture or subsistence is recognized, then what about the limits on pollution, the enforcement of water quality objectives to protect people's health, exercising that beneficial use? So a research collaboration ethic, I think, is central to these engagements. One of my students, advisees, Denise Martinez, who's in ecology, developed the framework for this from our Keepers of the Flame project. And these are, I'm working on adapting it to this work with water. So this is a work in progress, but openness and humility, considering that we have different understandings and approaches about water and water life between traditional practitioners, university researchers, and state policymakers. So foregrounding respective listening to develop a collaborative project, recognizing Indigenous epistemologies and responsibilities. And then reciprocity, recognizing the generosity of people sharing knowledge. How do we show that reciprocity in the process of doing the work? Responsibility, once you know about the issue, then you have to do something about it to help address these contamination issues. So I've been working with the California Indian Water Commission. This is some of the process we had proposed. We talked about this earlier this year at I think it was a freshwater sciences meeting. And so this is some of the process we're working through, and it's rapidly changing as we figure out what the needs are and what roles make the most sense for researchers and collaborators, and what is needed at the state level to impact the process. So I'm going to transition briefly to talking about a second project. This is funded by the National Institutes of Health, or NIEHS, National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, the Superfund research program. And this is a partnership between researchers at UC Davis and a variety of departments, and the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program specifically. And so on the left, this is, I feel like, another powerful juxtaposition. On the left, Yurok ancestral territory. This is in far northwestern California on the coast, and on the right, the recognized boundaries of the Yurok Reservation, 1 mile on either side of the Klamath, from the mouth at Requa to the meeting with the Trinity River at Witchpeck. These are some of the legacy impacts of mining within the Yurok homelands and within the boundaries of the Yurok Reservation. That's a conical burner. I think those are some ponds that were used for holding logs before they were moved downstream. And so there are a variety of contaminants associated with this infrastructure and with the history of timber development and extraction within Yurok homelands. So we were asked to participate in looking at cumulative exposure. So this is a slide I developed with a colleague there, Suzanne Fluharty, who's since retired, but she was at Yurok Tribe Environmental Program for many years. And so the concept that the general population is all there, we're all exposed to a whole bunch of different contaminants. But as I mentioned, for the beneficial uses work as well, we recognize that tribal members have additional and different types of exposure to pollutants, and that they have multi-generational exposures. And this is due to a host of environmental justice factors, including aerial spraying for timber production, in the 70s, 80s, and the impact on tribal members and on tribal water sources. So some aspects of exposure have to do with local subsistence, eating food from the local landscape. And then some of the psychosocial impacts of exposure. There have been so many layers of violence towards Indigenous people, and the contamination and the impacts on people's health, especially across generations, the impacts on being able to carry out traditional lifeways and responsibilities have a deep personal, social, emotional, cultural, spiritual impact as well. So it's important work. We recognize this contamination context of this long period of application of pesticides by various means, different types of pesticides, that there may be delayed impacts, multi-generational impacts from these pesticides. There's also biotoxins that are associated with both the dams, the water infrastructure upstream, as well as climate change. There's exposure from swimming, from eating from the rivers, and there's a need for locally people being able to test whether or not those contaminants are present. So together we are interested in the impacts of multiple toxics over time, impacting people and community health, really thinking again from a One Health approach in a variety of pathways. So the research design involved sampling both tributaries and sediments alongside the Klamath River and tributaries, looking at sites of timber infrastructure like that burner you saw a picture of, sites downstream of suspected contamination, which also comes from illegal marijuana grows in this region, as well as the timber processing I mentioned. And the goal is to protect traditional practitioners. You see the woman's hands weaving the basket on the lower right corner, and providing that information for people to make their own choices. So the tribe had previously done a community health profile with the California Tribal Epidemiology Center, and it just powerful work showing some health inequities. And on our next round, which we have applied for funding for this project, they requested funding for another community health profile, which I think is extremely important. So one of the areas of work that I was involved in as the community engagement core for this project was to kind of shift the cores and projects that are already well associated and developed with Superfund, and to center the Yurok community's questions and requests for researchers. So what can be done to reduce exposure? What are the chemicals that people are exposed to? Where is this contamination coming from? What policies can be impacted? What pathways do these chemicals affect? And what are daily activities that may expose people to these contaminants? So you can see these are somewhat cascading questions. So first identifying the contaminants, then thinking about their impacts as well as their source. And these are some diagrams that Tamara Solorzano, who's a PhD student in public health, developed, largely led the development of building on work that has been going on in the community engagement core. So trying to bring these different projects really into engagement, and not only the projects, but the researchers who are leading them into engagement with community members, with elders, with Yurok Tribe Environmental Program technicians, with youth, people who know about the culture, the exposure, and who have definite concerns about what these chemicals are and how they're impacting people's health. And I think the challenge is building that communication between the researchers working on these different projects and community members, so that then the pathway continues from the research to going back to the community to share what these what some of the identified issues are, and then to develop together some responses. So this is an overview of the process of the project. I'm not going to go over it in detail, but we've been doing sampling. Yurok Tribe Environmental Program has led the sampling, having developed the sampling design together with UC Davis researchers, particularly Tom Young in environmental engineering. And then looking at contaminants and looking at impacts, bioassays, looking at bioactivity. There's been some training of Yurok Tribe Environmental Program staff in some of the different techniques used. This had to do with microcystin immunoassays in this picture. And we have found some areas of concern. I'm not going to go into this in detail either, but some of the methods and analysis important to know, I think, to establish the research methods on the project. So looking both for chemicals of concern as well as screening for non-target chemicals, and then looking to see if the chemicals activate bioassays for estrogen receptors and aryl hydrocarbon receptors. And we have some results, some concerns from waters that are in mill sites. And so getting this information to the community so that they can use it, educating tribal members, making sure people aren't going in those waters, and then how do we think together about remediation. So this analysis is ongoing. These are some images looking at the potential effects on the development of a tadpole that was exposed to water from one of these mill ponds. So going through this project, we continue to collect and analyze samples, share the information, and compile resources broadly, even on contaminants. Sorry about the spelling error there. And then ideally collaborating to translate data into policy, but with the leadership of the tribe and how they want to approach that, and continuing to seek funding to keep up the work. And one of the projects we have out for consideration right now is a wristband monitoring project that tribal members requested, wanting to know more about what chemicals they're exposed to on a daily basis. And knowing again that tribal members engaged in traditional lifeways within tribal lands may have different chemical exposure profiles. And so these personal chemical exposure measurements would be gathered through silicone wristbands. And this is a little overview of the project. So a picture of individual exposure, but also aggregating the results and sharing that with the tribe. And we've grouped people by gender and location, prioritizing people who are engaged in subsistence and cultural activities. So this study isn't funded yet, but hopefully it will be funded. One of the things I am really happy about with this project proposal is that it was specifically requested by the community, by community members who would like to know more about their exposure profile. And I think it maps well onto the ongoing work looking at the sediment samples and the water samples. So we hope to get the study supported and be able to provide this information about toxic exposure and bring that together with the information we already have on the water and sediment samples. So I'll end there. That was 2 examples. I really just want to express my gratitude to the partners who I've worked with on these projects and their patience in building these collaborations, and also just really support the need for more collaborative work that takes very seriously those principles of listening, recognizing differences in approach, recognizing the colonial context that we are navigating, and working to develop solutions that can be used practically locally to address these ongoing environmental injustices in the form of environmental health.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Middleton Manning. I just did see that Amy put in the chat there that you can either submit your questions using the Q&A function, or you can put them in the chat box. There's a few of us kind of monitoring things, so I'll see them either way. We did get a couple questions while your talk was going on, so we'll start with those. Let's see, this first one is from Dr. Gilardi, and it has to do with the Indian Health Service, and if they work with tribal environmental management units on environmental contamination, that could be impacting human health on tribal lands? Or is there a disconnect between those two categories of agency? If so, do you have thoughts on if this is an opportunity for change? And she's asking in part because the Indian Health Service has generally been underfunded and limited in its delivery of health services to those communities. So let me
Yes,
know if you need me to repeat any part of that.
thank you. No, that's a great question. I think, yes, IHS is certainly an important partner. And in fact, I think they may be the sort of host organization or hub for the California Tribal Epidemiology Center, which is one of several tribal epidemiology centers around the nation. I think the challenge is exactly what you mentioned, that they have been underfunded and overstretched. And especially in California, I can't know all the details, but there's, because of the history of the non-ratification of treaties and the smaller tribal land bases, there's been less of an IHS presence in California than there has been elsewhere. I still think, though, IHS is definitely engaged. They do work with tribes, and I think they would be an important partner in this research. And that's, I'm glad you brought them up so that we could think about reaching out to them better and developing projects in partnership around environmental health.
Any other questions coming in? Oh, let's see. I think there's one here. Okay, one from Dr. Gatos. He says, thank you. We have a program in the Pacific Northwest and fund small grants in the 50K range. We're considering having a call for proposals just for tribes and First Nations. The question for you is, what are some things we traditionally ask from scientists that we may not want to ask of tribes and First Nations? I'm thinking of things like data sharing, peer-reviewed publication, and other expectations that might not be appropriate.
That's such a good question. I think you're absolutely right about the data sharing. I think it may be a process of working with the tribe's institutional review boards in terms of the types of information they are willing to share. But I think that's really exciting that there's a program, and these grants, I think, could be really important for tribal environmental departments who are already doing like the real frontline work in terms of gathering local samples and assessing them locally, and sometimes don't have the materials on site to do analysis or to develop tools for local individuals to determine when a contaminant is present. So I think that's really terrific. I love your question. I have to think more about it. I agree the data sharing is going to be a question of tribal sovereignty. There's some really good work on tribal data sovereignty coming out of University of Arizona, Native Nations Institute there. So I'd recommend looking at that, and I could share that. So there's some guidelines out there that I think could also be facing funders as they're also facing researchers. And rather than peer-reviewed publications, what I have seen be even more valuable are community-facing publications that are, I think often really colorful, show the species that's of particular concern, or maybe have nice diagrams of potential exposure pathways that include maybe culturally specific information that the tribe determines it wants to share, maybe limited to the name of the species. But that sort of product from the research is directly targeted to the community and making sure to keep the community safe and provide the information in a culturally accessible format. So that might be a better outcome than a peer-reviewed publication.
Thank you. And Dr. Gatos also echoes another thank you for your insights. Any other questions? We have about 5-ish minutes left in the Q&A. Oh, here we go. This one is actually from Amy Bond. When I was in grad school, I worked as a research assistant on an ecology-based project measuring the impact of cattle ranching on water systems. At the time, there was quite a lot of tension between ranchers and downstream Indigenous groups. Have those conversations, relationships, understandings improved at all with growing body of evidence of impact?
That's a great question. One of the things that I didn't mention is that, of course, some of the challenges of this work are once you identify the impact and the exposure pathways, sort of the I guess the political inertia to addressing those impacts, whether if they're still occurring, the regulatory structures that can help reduce the impacts and the discharges and the opposition that can be in place to those, or if they're legacy impacts, identifying the responsible party, and then establishing causality is extremely, that's the classic environmental justice issue in research, is that community members, people know I'm getting sick because of what's happening upstream or what's being dumped in the water. But the operation of public policy, and I think the burden of proof often continues to leave communities vulnerable, and it's really challenging for even for researchers to intervene in that cycle. So with that said, I don't know about the specific example that you're speaking of, but I would guess that it varies depending on the context. And, things are complex. There are also certainly, native ranchers and agricultural producers, and discharges come from all sorts of places, but it is across the board, traditional people living subsistence lifestyles who are most impacted. So I would guess those challenges still exist. And, I think the process of policymaking has a lot to do with trying to develop compromises. How can you reduce the emissions or the discharges without eliminating that particular producer? But taking into account, something I think about a lot is when that producer started that work and that discharge level was allowed, or when the dam was put in and totally changed the whole ecology of that river system. What thoughts went into that decision? OneHealth was not contemplated at that time, typically. It wasn't about the interconnected health of people and the environment and animals. It was really probably a more monetary consideration about how do we, operationalize or monetize the resource. And so if that's the assumption, health is the externality. So I think the challenge is to unpack and step back from that and recognize that we have to work in a different system because people are getting sick and the climate, overall ecosystem health is sickened by those decisions. So I kind of rambled a little bit. I'm not sure if I had a good response to that, but thank you. It's a really great question, and I think an ongoing issue.
Thank you. Let's see. I think we've gotten to all of our questions. So I think with our last couple minutes, I wanted to kind of, I guess this is another question, an open question, but I'm thinking a lot about the next generation of students, and especially at the K through 12 level, but also at the university level, coming up and seeing Indigenous representation in their coursework and their schooling, and how that intersects with science. And I'm just wondering if there have been any, in your experience in teaching or engaging with these different demographics, just impactful ways to incorporate this awareness and just recognition of Indigenous culture, whether it's in basic science as we think of it, or social sciences, or everything in between. Are there certain approaches, or just what have you kind of seen land and really hit home with students?
Thank you. Well, I think tribal publications are really helpful, so that I've referenced that graphic of the Yurok aquatic subsistence. That's on the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals website, which has a whole lot of tribal climate adaptation plans. So referring to documents that are coming directly from tribes, films that are produced by tribes, I think is really helpful. Kind of foregrounding in the readings that I assign the voices of tribal members. And speaking of voices, hearing directly from people actually in person within their homelands is the most powerful. So with the Community Engagement Corps for Superfund, my effort is always, how do we get the different researchers who are leading these different projects up to the Klamath outside with elders and traditional practitioners who can talk in place. This is what happens when I'm splitting a piece of basketry material with my teeth, and this is the impact that's happening, and this is how important baskets are to me, and this is where we've gathered for generations. I mean, you can't, I think, even begin to understand that coming from an outside perspective unless you're with somebody on the land listening with an open mind. So I think that's key.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we are at time, perfectly on time. So thank you so much, Dr. Middleton Manning. Really, really wonderful talk, and we did record it because I know there's several people who couldn't make it today or could only stay for part of it or some combination therein. I also see that Amy put a link to the survey in the chat box. Please, if we could just shamelessly plug and beg you all to make sure you do that survey. It's really important for us in the health of our grant and reporting back out to the funding program. So please take 5 minutes to do that. And with that, I will release you all. And thank you all for coming. And thank you for sharing your time and energy with us, Dr. Middleton Manning.
Thank you for having me.